All right. Good morning. Welcome to our study of Revelation. This is our first study, or first class of this study. So it's good that you're all, it's good to be with you and glad you're here. Before we begin, let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we're thankful for another day that you've given us. We're thankful for another opportunity that we can spend studying your word. Father, we ask for your help, especially with this particular book. We realize that it was probably much easier for the original audiences than it is for us, but please help us to realize what you were trying to get across, the best of our ability. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so because of the nature of the book, I feel like we ought to spend a good deal of time, maybe more than for other books of the Bible that we might study, in introduction. And so we'll use this class as an introduction, but we may continue that on Wednesday. So you notice on this slide there's a graphic depiction. Well, I did that. So why are you laughing? Why? Do you not think I'm capable of this? Well, if you think that, you're absolutely right. I couldn't even get close to that. So, no, this is from a graphic novel that was published by Zondervan, I think about 10 years ago or so. Very interesting depictions. And so we're going to look at this from time to time when I can find the right sort of picture, because what we're dealing with in the book of Revelation, of course, is a series of visions. These are things that John saw. Well, when we read the text, we can't really experience that. We can't see what he saw. So it is worth considering, what was that like to see that? So I think a graphic novel is a really good way maybe to try to do that. Maybe give us some idea of what it would have been like to see these awesome images. That's what they are. In the book. And so this is, by the way, this is the rider on a white horse that's depicted in chapter 19 of Revelation. All right, well, before we really get into the difficulty of the book, because we got to talk about that, of course, I want us to just get this out of the way. And in fact, if you want, after this slide, you can just leave, because this is what the book is about. I'm hoping that we can get further than just that, but I think we can say this for sure. What is the book about? With all the imagery, the numbers, the symbols, the structure that's a problem, what is it really about? When everything is said and done, I think these are the two main points. First, God should be properly honored at the expense. Yeah, that's a strong statement, but I think it's accurate. At the expense of others who might claim authority. Maybe they would claim similar authority to God, as is the case in Revelation. But the other one is, God will be victorious in the end. Anybody see any practical value of either of these points? Well, of course. I mean, think about this first point. This is subversive. What does that mean? That means that the government and the leaders in whatever country and whatever political situation are not the be-all, end-all of authority. God is. Is that relevant? Is that worth remembering? Of course. Because, I mean, just think about what's happened recently in the last few weeks, midterm elections. I heard somebody say this is the most important midterm election we've ever faced. They've said that about the last few presidential races too. And they'll probably say it about the upcoming one. I mean, are they important? Yeah. But ultimately, whoever is in power, whoever is elected, is always going to be secondary to God. And that's really comforting, right? Because whoever gets in office is what? A human being. And they're imperfect. I mean, we can criticize our leaders, as a society if we want, but ultimately, they fail because they're human beings. God doesn't have that problem. So immediately, Revelation is practical, right? Well, the second point also is worth remembering, because what John was experiencing and what we experience doesn't seem like God's victory, does it? I mean, when you look out at the world and all the corruption and immorality, etc., does it look like God's winning right now? I mean, just say it. Does it look like He's winning? It doesn't look like it. But Revelation says He will. And of course, Revelation is the only place in the Bible that says that. But Revelation says it, and I think, you may disagree with this, but I think very clearly it says, God's winning. We don't have to wonder about that, right? It's not like we spend our lives hoping He's going to win, but when it all boils down to it, at the end we think, or when we get close to the end, we think, well, let's just see what happens. No, we don't see what happens. He wins. That's what Revelation says. All right? So, why is Revelation so difficult? Because generally, I think there are two approaches to the book of Revelation by believers. One of which is people are obsessed with it. That's all they want to study. And there's a good reason for that, because the images in the book are extremely memorable. That's why I think it really lends itself to a graphic novel, like we just looked at a sample of in the title slide. But the other approach, the other extreme is we just ignore it. We just completely ignore it. Why is that? We're not quite sure what to do with it. So some of you are aware of this. The last 4 or 5 weeks, I've lost track, but I've been preaching at different places, like filling in. And you know when they call me, they really need some help, right? I'm at the bottom of the barrel. That's okay, but you know they need help. So anyway, I went. Do you know how many times I quoted Revelation in all those sermons? 3 or 4 sermons. 0. Out of the last few years when I've filled in to preach, I can count on one hand how many times I've quoted from Revelation. And most of the time, it's either in chapters 2, 3, 4, or 5, or the very end of the book. And that's been my experience for others as well. You know what? I need to change that. I need to think a lot more about this book, and hopefully we can do that. But one of the reasons we don't is because of this. It's difficult. Let's not pretend like it's not. It is. Well, why is it so difficult? Is it the literary genre? The genre is difficult. We'll talk about what that means here in just a minute. The imagery, which of course is related to the genre, is that easy to figure out? Nope, it's not. What about the symbolism? Is that easy to figure out? No, the politics. What do I mean by that? Some of the things that are said in Revelation have ramifications for the political situation in ancient Rome. A lot of it does, in fact. Is that easy to understand? Nope, it's not. But I think out of everything up here, the most difficult thing about Revelation is the structure. How should we think about the structure of Revelation and in terms of the future and what's going to happen? Is it chronological? Or is it a recapitulation, as I'll say in a minute? Okay, from the perspective of the text, just the text, there are 2 main sections. That's easy, right? You've got a prologue, the first 8 verses of chapter 1, and then you got an epilogue, which is Revelation 20 through 21. But then the 2 main sections, you have a theophany of the exalted Messiah. What's a theophany? Anybody know? Yeah. Yeah, good. It's an appearance of God. That's what this is. But it's of the exalted Messiah. So that's chapter 1, 9 through 3:22. Of course, this is where you have the letters to the 7 churches. Chapter 4, verse 1 to 22:9, those are visions related through a heavenly journey. There's a door opened in heaven, and John walks through the door, and that's where we see all these visions. Or not we, but that's where he saw all these visions, right? So that's easy. But what's not easy, particularly, is this second section. How does all that fit together? Chapter 6 through 19. Is it a linear sequence of events? In other words, this happens, then this happens, then this happens. Is that how it is? And that's how a lot of people see it. Right? If Revelation is a prediction of the future, and some people think that's all it is. If it is a prediction of the future, what's going to happen when? People use Revelation for that. Is that the best way to understand it? Well, I don't think so. And I'll explain more why I think that in just a minute. I think it's more likely that this is a recapitulation. In other words, the events in Revelation 6 through 19, or I should say the visions in 6 through 19, are not to be understood in a chronological fashion. So let's get more specific. What's in chapters 6 through 19? Well, you got the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the 7 unnumbered visions, and the 7 bowls of wrath. So you got these groups of 7. So are we to imagine that everything that's included in the 7 seals, that takes place, then once that's finished and has historical reference, once that's done, well then the 7 trumpets start. Once that's done, then the 7 bowls of wrath start. Because that's really the problem. You have 3 groups of 7, and they're all judgments upon the world. And that's how, again, people view this as like a roadmap to what's going to happen in the future. I think that's highly problematic. I mean, for the simple reason is once you get to the 7 bowls of wrath, there's really not much left to destroy. It's already been destroyed. So we have to make everything so metaphorical in that case. And this is another problem with Revelation. We make things so metaphorical, they're almost without meaning. So I think the way to look at this is kind of like this. I didn't come up with this example. I'm not very good at coming up with analogies. The analogy that I heard is it's kind of like if you were tasked with the job of filming a football game or soccer game or whatever, and let's say you filmed it with your phone while you're in the stands. Okay, for part of it you filmed it with your phone. From the other part you filmed it from either behind the goal or whatever, right? Completely different location. Well, then you had access to a blimp, so you could video it from that. You're videoing the same event, but from different perspectives. I think that's how to see this part of Revelation. That makes a lot more sense, in my opinion. When we get to this section, I'll get into more detail about this. All right, now, first of all, any questions so far? Yes? For this section, I think so. That's a very good way to summarize it. Maybe I should have said that. So yeah, thank you for saying that. Yeah, I think so. All right, now, any other questions? Okay. What about the genre? Revelation tells us that. It's an apocalypse. In fact, the word revelation comes from the very first word, or the very first verse of the book. In Greek, apocalypsis, which of course means revelation. That's where we get the word. What do we think about when we think about the word apocalypse or apocalyptic? What do we think about? What does our society think about, maybe? We could put it that way. Yeah, it's like destruction, but destruction on a very large scale. One very common genre of movies and television and video games and books is post-apocalyptic. What does that mean? That means after a major world event. And so That's, of course, not what this means, even though, where do we get that idea? Probably this book of Revelation, which is an apocalypse. Well, what does that mean? The fact that it's an apocalypse, what does that mean? Well, first of all, we got to come up with a definition. Let me just be very clear here. This is a controversial definition. It's not perfect, but no definition of the word and genre apocalypse is sufficient to everybody. You wouldn't believe how much time scholars have spent trying to figure out just how to define the genre. So that ought to tell us to be careful with it. We can't say definitive things about it that are applicable for everything we might characterize as an apocalypse. But generally, I think this definition works and is helpful. This is from Collins. He wrote a book called Apocalyptic Imagination, which is actually deals more with Jewish apocalypses rather than Revelation, even though he does have a section later on about the book of Revelation. But this is what he says. Apocalypse is a genre of revelatory literature with a narrative framework. It tells a story, right? And one of the things that I just said about those groups of seven, what story are they telling? And like he aptly commented, they're telling the story of seven destructive acts, I guess we could say, right? So anyway, it's a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient. Do we have that in Revelation? Yep, absolutely. Disclosing a transcendent reality. What does that mean? Anybody know what transcendent reality means? You've probably already used this phrase this morning, right? Everybody woke up talking about transcendent realities. Now, what does it mean? Yeah, right. More than the physical world. There's a reality that transcends that. Not only can we not see it, it's better. It's higher, right? Okay, so that fits Revelation, the book of Revelation. Well, it says it's temporal, which means it does have something to do with time, insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation. All right, here's another word that you probably use very often. Eschatological. What does that mean? Yeah, exactly. It's a study of the end times. Yeah, this includes the return of Jesus, the resurrection, the final judgment, etc. So this is salvation, ultimate salvation, final salvation, I should say. All right, and spatial insofar as it involves another supernatural world, which sounds very much like the transcendent reality that he just mentioned. So you can see that they go very well together. So I think this is a helpful definition. Revelation fits all that. But there's parts of Revelation that don't really fit into that definition, like the epistles. And that's one of the problems when it comes to the genre of Revelation. What do you do with these epistles in chapters 2 and 3? I'll try to address that problem before we talk about them. All right? Any other questions about this definition? Okay, we may quibble with it a little bit later, perhaps, but overall, I think that's pretty helpful. Okay, here's the question, though. Why did John choose this kind of writing? Did he have other options? You bet he did. There are other options in the New Testament. We've got Gospels, we have epistles, we have a sermon, which I think is what Hebrews is, sort of. Right? I think it's probably more like a sermon than an epistle, even though we often call it the Epistle to the Hebrews, but I think it's more like a sermon. And then we got the book of Acts, historical narrative. So he had other options. Why an apocalypse? Now, one explanation that I've heard is, well, he wrote it in such a coded fashion so that he wouldn't be persecuted. Because if the Roman authorities saw this subversive message, he would have been persecuted for sure. Conceptually, that makes sense. But in reality, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think the Roman authorities had time to monitor what Christians were writing in most cases. They didn't care what this guy's writing. Okay? That's what I would assume. They don't have time to deal with this message that was going to how many people? We have no idea. But I just don't see any evidence that that's the case. I think it's simply that this is the way you recorded revelatory oracles. In other words, when someone received this vision or visions from God, how else do you put it in a literary form? This is it. This is how other people did it. This is how he chose to do it, right? I think that's the simplest explanation. So again, the genre fits the circumstance. That's all it is, I think. That is maybe not as exciting and interesting as the first explanation, but I think this is more likely than the other one that I've heard before, right? Okay. Here are some other examples of apocalyptic literature, and I really hope you can read that top one better than I can. Man. But what are there apocalyptic texts in the Old Testament? Well, with the exception of Daniel, because with Daniel you say yes. At least parts of it would be considered apocalyptic based upon the definition that I gave a little bit earlier. But what about other texts? Sort of. So these passages, Isaiah 24 to 27 and 65 to 66, Ezekiel 38 to 39, that's that passage where he talks about Gog and Magog, Joel 3 and 4, Zechariah 9 through 14, these are often referred to as proto-apocalyptic. And that's because they clearly contain the seeds of what later becomes apocalyptic literature, right? So these authors, like John, use the images, and particularly the eschatological images that you find in these books, to create their own book. But it's not quite the same as you have in Daniel or you would have in Revelation. Now, you may say, okay, I can understand that, but why have you got this stuff up here that's non-canonical Jewish and Christian literature? Why would we care what that has to say? Well, that's because even though these books aren't in the canon necessarily, that doesn't mean they weren't influential. And the clearest example of this that I'm thinking about is in the book of Jude, where Jude quotes from 1st Enoch in Greek. It is a quotation. It's really hard to argue with that point, right? Why is he quoting Enoch? Does he think it's canonical? Not necessarily. I don't think he does. But it was authoritative. People understood it. People read it a lot. So these texts are important. Is John familiar with some of these apocalypses or things that would be like found in those apocalypses? Absolutely. So this includes, as I said, 1st Enoch. 1st Enoch is a composite work. It was written, parts of it were written at different periods, but essentially the earliest part of it, 3rd century BC. It's early, okay? And it deals with essentially Genesis 6, 1 through 4. It's an expansion of Genesis 6, 1 through 4. So that one's very important. 2nd Enoch is less important. 2nd Baruch is important. 3rd Baruch, less so. 4th Ezra is also important. This was written about the time the book of Revelation was. It seems to deal with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Okay, so yeah, we will come back to those books from time to time when I think it's relevant. All right? So any questions about this or comments? Okay, so let me summarize this. I'm going to do this a few times in this introduction in particular because I don't want us to get lost and not see the forest for the trees, right? So what am I trying to say? Revelation uses characteristics of a genre that we can see exemplified in books in the canon, but also books outside the canon. And the question then becomes, what are the features? And how do you figure this out? Well, you look at these other books. Sometimes when I teach some classes, I'll mention these books, and students rightly ask the question, are these books worth reading? Well, sort of. And, well, I mean, some of them are, some of them aren't. But I think in this particular case, it could only help, right? So anyway, when you do that, you figure out all these features. So what are the features of the genre? Well, one of which that we see in the book of Revelation is the use of numbers, and in particular, the number 7 here. 54 times the book uses the number 7. 7 churches we see in chapters 2 and 3. The 7 spirits, lampstands, torches, 7 spirits. I've got that up there twice. 7 eyes and horns of the Lamb, angels, thunders, head of the great dragon. And then here are a couple that are easier to miss. There are 7 beatitudes. Did you know Revelation has beatitudes? Just like Jesus spoke in Matthew 5, right? And elsewhere. Well, Revelation has it too. 7 of them. And then the 7-fold use of every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. So was the author conscious or consciously using this number? Yeah, he was. What does the number mean? Good question. I think it probably means something like it's the perfect number. But I feel it's interesting, or I think it's interesting when people talk about some of the numbers in Revelation. They are very confident. We know exactly what this means. Well, how do we know what it means? I think that's the good question. And I think for this one, it's pretty easy. Some of the other numbers in Revelation is not as easy. All right, some other characteristics. A heavenly throne room scene. God is very often referred to as the one sitting on the throne. Why is he called that? Do you know? Can you think about why he might be referred to that way? Exactly. Exactly. The throne represents power. It represents the rule. And of course, this is the ruler of the universe. So again, it reinforces that first point that I mentioned. He's the one in control. You see this just by the mention of these heavenly throne room scenes and by the fact that God is typically referred to as the one who sits on the throne. Okay? Here are some other ones, and here's one other one that some of you are probably familiar with, and that is the use of the Old Testament. But the author doesn't use the Old Testament like other New Testament writers typically do. Paul, for example, will often quote from the Old Testament, as does Matthew. The author of Revelation hardly ever does that. His use of the Old Testament comes from allusions. And it's very sophisticated. One thing I'll mention in a little bit, but I'll go ahead and say it now. The way the author writes the book of Revelation, it means Greek is not his first language. I mean, the way the book is written, the guy looks like he barely knows Greek. And I'm not being flippant. That's just reality. And so you might think, this guy's not very educated. That's not true at all. The way he uses the Old Testament is very sophisticated. Take a look at chapter 1, for example. Look at all the allusions. There is one quotation here, but look at all the allusions just from chapter 1. Chapter 1, verse 5, Psalm 89:27. Verse 6, Exodus 19:6. 7, Zechariah 12:10. 13 through 15, Daniel 7:13 through 14. And also chapter 10, 5 and 6. 1:15, Ezekiel 1:24. Verse 6, 16, Isaiah 49:2. You get the point. We have to be paying very careful attention when the author alludes to the Old Testament. In fact, I'll go ahead and say we won't have time to look at every single allusion to the Old Testament. There are just too many of them. Okay, so again, this is the author's modus operandi, right? This is the way he writes, the way he operates in writing his text. So again, this is highly sophisticated, even though the language isn't. All right, speaking of authorship issues. So when you look at a book where the authorship is not straightforward, we have internal evidence, we have external evidence. External evidence is what other people have said about the text, and maybe this is other texts themselves, or archaeology could help, although I think that's far less likely. And then you have internal evidence. What does the text say about itself, but also what are the features of the text that say something about the author? So what's the internal evidence? Well, the author identifies himself as John. Chapter 1, verse 1. Verse 4, verse 9, and then again 22 to 8. The author is John. There's no question about it. The question is, which John is it? And you may think, well, that's a bizarre question. Well, we'll address that in just a minute. Okay, so John's the author. No doubt. And by the way, I mentioned how Revelation is an apocalypse. But here's a case where it's different than other apocalypses, or at least some other apocalypses, not all of them. But some apocalypses, like 1st Enoch, like 4th Ezra, like 2nd Baruch, they claim to be written from certain people. But scholars don't think that person wrote the text. So they're pseudonymous. They use a false name. Revelation doesn't do that. The author gives his name, and it's just John. Okay? Now, the other thing that's characteristic about this author that's also different from the way other New Testament writers use the Old Testament, and that is a lot of New Testament writers, I would say very high percentage of the time, quote from the Greek Old Testament. Why is that? Well, they knew it better, I think, right? Not the author of Revelation. He shows a familiarity with the Hebrew Old Testament, which reinforces this idea that Greek is not his first language. So I think that's an interesting feature too. Now, apocalypses were produced in Palestine. You know how many apocalypses we have outside of Palestine that were clearly produced outside of Palestine? Because remember, the first century takes place in the time of diaspora. What does that mean? Well, that means that there are Jews living outside of Palestine. In fact, more Jews lived outside of Palestine than lived in there during the first century. But of all those Jewish communities living outside of Palestine, do you know how many produced apocalypses? 0. We don't have any example of that. So in other words, apocalypses were produced strictly in Palestine. So the author presumably was from Palestine, which may not be surprising, right? It's not revolutionary, but it is a feature of the text. He's not a native Greek speaker, as I've said before. And let me explain this. One of the reasons that I wanted to learn Greek so many years ago now is I wanted to know if there was a difference between how certain New Testament writers wrote than other ones. So, for example, if you learn New Testament Greek, like one of the first things you read from the Bible are passages from like 1 John. Why is that? Because it's easy. Now, after you get a little bit comfortable with that, then you might move on to the Gospel of John, which is also pretty easy. It's a little bit more difficult. But let me tell you which books you're not going to read first. Hebrews, because it's the most difficult Greek in the entire New Testament, not even close. That's fairly close to classical levels of Greek. And you're not going to read the book of Revelation. And do you know why? Because the author sometimes doesn't follow the rules of grammar. And if you weren't looking at me, I had air quotes when I said rules of grammar because, of course, there's this debate as to whether grammar is prescriptive or descriptive. We don't have to go into that. I'm sure you're very thankful for that. But if you look at the grammar and then you look at what the author's doing, he doesn't follow it. So he's not a native Greek speaker. This is, maybe we could even go so far as to say, this is like barbarian Greek. All right, so that's the internal evidence. The author's clearly from Palestine, I think. He knows the Old Testament. Greek is not his first language, and his name's John. Now we get into more interesting evidence, I think, and that is external. What's the earliest connection between the book of Revelation and the Apostle John? 155, Justin Martyr. And here's the question, can we trust him? And when I say that about these early church fathers, I don't mean they're lying. They're just making stuff up. I don't mean that. Sometimes they did that, right? But other times they were given information and maybe they didn't have the critical tools to evaluate it like we would maybe. So it's possible somebody told him this and he believed it, but it doesn't make it true, right? But there's also other evidence that there's another John in the picture here, and that's this guy called John the Elder that's mentioned in this passage from Eusebius, who's an early church historian, 2nd and 3rd century. And Eusebius tells us so much we wouldn't know about if it weren't for him. It's very valuable, okay? But he says John the Elder is responsible for the book of Revelation. Now, what I don't have up here is the obvious question, what is the connection? We talked about language. What is the connection when it comes to language between the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation? There are some connections, but it's very different. The way it's written is very different. Some scholars will go so far as to say it's impossible that the same author wrote Revelation and wrote John. Impossible. Now, maybe that's a little bit of an overstatement. But because somebody might say, well, wait a minute. He's writing a different genre. Doesn't that require different ways of writing? That's true. But the gap, I think, is too big. So what some people think is that John the Apostle and John the Elder were like in the same group. So this explains the similarities between the Gospels, the Gospel and Revelation, but it also explains maybe the difference too. So that's what some people think. Does it matter a whole lot? Not really. But I will say this, one argument to make that's worth making is in the epistles, the author never appeals to his own authority. Is it important in New Testament epistles for the author to appeal to his authority, his own authority? Is that important? Does Paul ever do it? Yes, he does. John never does that. And at the end of the book, in chapter 22, he talks about the apostles as if it's in the past tense. Would he do that if he's an apostle? Well, I don't know. Okay, so those are worth thinking about. Again, it doesn't really matter a whole lot. So the author is John, whichever way you want to slice it. Okay, any questions or comments about this? All right. I don't know what that means, but anyway. All right. The date. I let out a loud sigh because I don't understand the passion, we'll say, with which some people argue about this subject. A few years ago, I was talking to somebody about this subject. He was trying to convince me of the earlier dating. And I really wasn't budging. I thought I was very respectful. This person was older than me, had studied the topic a lot. And I was trying to be respectful, and I said, well, I don't think I'm convinced of that, right? He got so upset. He left. He just like abruptly left. So I don't get it. I don't understand why people are so passionate about this. But on the other hand, does it matter what the date is? You know, we talk about some books, it doesn't really matter what the date is, right? So, for example, Gospel of Matthew. Most scholars would date it, I think, to like 70 to 90 AD. Does it really matter if it was written in 75 or 95? I mean, does it really matter? Not really. Revelation does matter when it comes to the date, so maybe that is why some people are pretty passionate about it. So what's the evidence here, the internal, external evidence? Well, the internal evidence, and by the way, there are arguments for the early date. One passage in particular is chapter 11, where we have these two guys, these two figures, these two messengers who measure the temple. Now, would this make any sense if the temple was still standing? That's the argument. Why would he be measuring a temple if the temple's already destroyed? I think that's not as strong as some people think, because again, John could have in mind this temple just in a visionary experience. It doesn't say anything about whether it's standing or not. So I don't think that's a particularly strong argument. Chapter 17, 9 through 11, this is where it's believed that there are rulers that are mentioned. And if you count them up, the last ruler is Nero. When did Nero reign? 64 to 70 was generally the time frame. So people say this is when the book was written. That, I think, is a bit of a stronger argument. And so we'll get to that. All right, so that's the internal evidence. What's the external evidence? You know, I don't have anything up there because I don't think there is anything to it. All right, so in terms of internal evidence, one passage that I would say is pretty difficult to understand, 17 through 9 through 11, is the one passage that's used. What about the later date that I would say most still adopt? And that is the external evidence and the internal evidence are very strong. The external evidence, Irenaeus in 180, dates it to the reign of Domitian, who's reigning in is the cipher to which the judgment, the nation that the judgment is coming to. Okay? Now, can we look in other places, in other apocalypses, but also other texts, and see how is Babylon used as a cipher? What does Babylon refer to in every one of those texts? Rome. Every time. Some people think, who are proponents of the early date, that if it's written in the early date, Babylon has to refer to Jerusalem. It never does. In any text, anywhere. So is it possible? Revelation is the exception. Yeah, it's possible. I've said this probably a million times. Some of these students over here are probably like, oh boy, here he goes again. But it doesn't matter what's possible, really. What matters is what's most likely, what's most probable. So in this case, is it more likely that Babylon refers to Jerusalem or Rome? No question it's Rome. All right, but that's just one piece of evidence. That's not the only thing, of course. Chapter 13, verse 14 talks about this ruler who died, but he's alive again. This fits pretty well, this myth that was floating around in the later first century that Nero was alive again. Sometimes it's just referred to as Nero redivivus, or Nero lives again, right? So in other words, Nero's come back to life. That seems to be what it's referred to in chapter 13. Is that view attested earlier than 90? Yeah, but not much. It's more likely that it's characteristic of the late first century. And this is a problem we're going to talk about later, because it is a problem. And that is the problem of persecution. Were Christians persecuted in the New Testament? Yep, there's plenty of evidence for that. On what scale were they persecuted is really the question. And again, we'll get to that later. But the way it's used here with the date is, was the persecution greater in the late first century or less? It depends on who you ask, really. Because, and I'll just say this, because at the time of Nero, we have specific non-Christian evidence that Nero persecuted Christians. We don't have that about Domitian. Okay, and this last point, 6:6, I think is less important. Okay, so we'll get to that. All right, let me summarize this, and then it'll be it for this morning. Okay, some evidence is there to the early date. It really is. But I think the internal evidence taken together makes the case for the later date much stronger. Much stronger. Okay, so this has been a very truncated version of this debate. You could read all day long about it, but for me, these are the essential points. I want to mention this, and then that'll be yours. It's also possible that some of those passages that look earlier may be reflective of an earlier source. It's possible the author used other sources. Does the Bible ever admit to using sources? Before anybody says, well, wait a minute, the Bible used sources? Does the Bible ever admit to using sources? Anybody know? Yes, it does. Many, many times. So, for example, in the Old Testament, when it's talking about a king in 1st and 2nd Kings or 1st and 2nd Chronicles, sometimes it'll say, are these not written in the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? Do we have that source? We don't have it anymore. Okay, so that's not outside the realm of possibility too. Okay, but of course for us, that's less important. All right, we'll pick this up on Wednesday. Thank you.